and welcome to the Library Loudhailer, the podcast of the National Library of New Zealand, Te Puna, Mātauranga o Aotearoa. My name is Sean McMahon, and together with Mary Hay, we'll be sharing some of the unique voices and stories from our library staff and collections. In this new series, Voices, we'll be listening to some of the National Library's favourite blogs. The library blog stretches back 16 years, so we have plenty to choose from. We are aiming to get episodes out on a semi-regular basis. Each Voices episode will begin with a brief overview of the blog post to provide some context, followed by a reading of the post itself. Check our show notes for a link to the original post and to see any associated images. In today's episode, we'll hear the voices of New Zealand soldiers in the First World War, writing in their diaries. It's Just Hell Here Now is a blog written by the manuscripts curator David Colquhoun to commemorate Anzac Day on the 25th of April 2013. David worked as a curator with the Turnbull Library for over 26 years, and in that time he developed a deep knowledge of the library's diaries and letters. After retiring in 2014, David sadly passed away in 2018. In his blog, David refers to the work of the World War I Digitisation Project. Under David's guidance, this project digitised over 240 First World War diaries and letters as part of the library's commitment to marking the centenary of the Great War. For the digitisation project, David selected a sample of manuscripts that gave as wide a range of war experiences as possible. While most were written by soldiers and nurses, there are also some wartime diaries and letters written by civilians back in New Zealand. In his blog, David endeavoured to convey the poignancy of these war letters and diaries. He focused primarily on the diaries, noting that letters are fascinating too, but they do often skirt around the ugliness of war, so as not to cause alarm to friends, lovers and family back home. The diaries can be much more frank. Typically, the diaries are battered little notebooks, sometimes hard to read and often erratically kept, but they can give graphic insights into the shock of war. As we approach Anzac Day in 2024, marking the 110th anniversary of the outbreak of the First World War, it seems an appropriate time to revisit David's blog and hear directly from the soldiers at the front. It's Just Hell Here Now by David Colquhoun, published April 24th, 2013. Captain Alexander McCall's diary entry for the 25th and 26th of April echoes the excitement seen in many war diaries as the soldiers leave Lemnos and steam towards Gallipoli. This was the big adventure they had signed up for. But even before he landed, his troop ship was taking in the wounded because the hospital ships were already full.
At 6 a.m. this morning, a move was made. We pulled anchor and moved slowly out. The warships and fleet left a little before us and presented a great sight. We were following two big barges. Absolutely magnificent scenery. Everyone greatly excited. At the time of writing, can see the warships bombarding and the Tommies landing under cover. A magnificent sight. We are landing further up. Half the company landed about 4 p.m. and I with the other half did not get ashore until 11 p.m. About 7 p.m. they commenced fetching wounded aboard our ship as all the hospital ships are full. The Australians, who landed first, performed brilliantly but lost heavily. So also did our Auckland and Canterbury boys. We got about 100 wounded before leaving, some of them being awfully bad. At midnight, we got orders to line a ridge just above headquarters, and we've been here all day. Fighting has been continuous for 15 hours, but we have been lucky enough to have only shrapnel bursting over us and a few bullets.
Unlike many other diarists, McColl nearly always remains determinedly optimistic. Henry Kitchen's diary's entries for the landing convey much more anxiety as he waited for orders to disembark, trying to stay calm and positive and not quite succeeding.
We're all ready to go ashore, just waiting for the boats to come and take us off. Then we'll be into it. The Australians have captured 3 Krupp guns and sent back word to say they are knocking hell out of the Turks. We are not allowed to take blankets or waterproof sheets. I bet it'll be cold. Thank goodness I've got my oil slick coat. It will be a great comfort, I'm sure. I've got a good red beard to frighten the enemy. Well, we're off in a minute. Bye-bye. Bayonet charge. Bye-bye.
That bayonet charge was called off, but there was no respite. The next page of his diary describes how he
dug in and waited in firing line. The Turks came good and hard. Position looked very serious. Naval guns great help. No packs, cold wind, slept on wet clay. Turks attacked all night. Jolly glad when day came. No sleep. Calls for bayonet charges all night. New Zealanders lost heavily. Sniped at all day. Very lucky.
Meanwhile, Richard Dowling was part of the ambulance corps, setting up a hospital on the beach. His diary entries a few days later were brief but telling.
Saw some awful wounds, many snipers about. Dead men's kits strewn all over the beach. Beginning to realise what war is.
One of those broken by the Gallipoli experience was farm worker Alfred Cameron. His early diary entries too were full of curiosity and excitement at the big adventure. Over several harrowing weeks of frontline fighting, those entries became steadily more despairing. Here is his last entry, written in late May after several weeks of fighting in the Gallipoli trenches.
Any day. It's just hell here now. No water or tucker. Only 7 out of 23 in number 1 troop. On duty rest, either dead or wound. Damn the place. No good writing anymore.
Cameron was invalided home soon afterwards. Many other war diaries end just as suddenly as his does, but that was more often because the writer had been killed. McColl's diary, for example, ends abruptly in early 1916, just before he was machine gunned during a night raid on enemy trenches in France. George Bollinger's 1915 diary has been digitised. It was a well-written diary full of observation, sometimes thoughtful, sometimes graphic. A few weeks after describing the aftermath of Chunuk Bair.
All up the gully was the frightful smell of dead.
There is this description of a rare day free of snipers and shelling.
Everything has been quiet today. Persistent rumour says we're soon to leave the peninsula for a rest. This evening, the Māoris conducted a church service. Everything seemed so quiet and peaceful, and as those 40-odd voices sang those songs we usually sing at the front, Lead Kindly Light, Abide With Me, Nearer My God to Thee, etc., our thoughts were drawn from war and care towards home.
Bollinger's resigned comments in December 1915, as the New Zealanders prepared to leave Gallipoli, would have been shared by many others. Almost 3,000 had died for no military gain. Mimicking Tenson's famous lines about the doomed charge of the Light Brigade, Bollinger wrote,
"We will not be terribly proud of our Gallipoli bar. Ours is not to reason why, but just to do and die. But who has blundered?"
Back in New Zealand, others were becoming disillusioned with the war effort. In early 1916, for example, the widely read New Zealand Truth newspaper declared the Gallipoli campaign to be one of the most deplorably disastrous adventures in the history of British arms. The plundering by the British leadership, it went on, was as Brobdingnagian as anything depicted in Gulliver's Travels. By then, Anzac Day was being planned as a national day of commemoration. It was a day for mourning and remembering the dead, but it was also an opportunity for the government and the conservative press to rally against war weariness. The photograph in the show notes depicts a rallying ceremony at Petone outside the railway station. The crowd had just heard a patriotic speech from the Prime Minister. Now they were listening to a massed choir of over 1,000 local children singing "Rule Britannia." Massey words at Petone were typical of the editorials and other speeches of that day. He eulogised Anzac bravery, extolled the Empire's war effort, which, he said, stood for one people, one language, one destiny, and one ideal, which was the uplifting of humanity. Many New Zealanders shared his imperial sentiments. Soon afterwards, conscription was introduced, and thousands more soldiers sailed off to the killing fields of Europe.
And that wraps up today's episode of Voices, where we've reflected on the powerful narratives shared through the diaries of New Zealand soldiers from World War I. These candid accounts, preserved by the Alexander Turnbull Library, have given us an unfiltered glimpse into the realities of war. These handwritten reflections serve not only as historical documents, but also as poignant reminders of the human experiences behind the great conflicts of our past. As Anzac Day approaches, let's honour their memories by engaging with these voices from a century ago, ensuring their stories continue to resonate in our collective consciousness. Thank you for joining us in this journey through history. For more about this episode, have a look at the show notes, which include images and a link to a video in Te Ara Encyclopedia of New Zealand about George Bollinger. If you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to the Library Loudhailer, share it with your friends, or leave a rating and review. Thanks again, and see you next time for another episode in our Voices series. Mā te wā.
Mā te wā.